special education in our school systems a must-have, or is it just another way to isolate and stigmatize children with special needs? That is our question this week on The Opinion. I am Mirna Santiago, and joining me as co-host for this week is author, journalist, writer, reporter, DeRita.
Thank you for having me. Our special guest today is a local author and teacher, and he has his own show right here at Comcast. Let's Talk Writing. I'd like to welcome Vincent Dacquino. Thank you for being here, Vincent.
Well, pleasure. Thank you for having me. We have a great topic this week, one that it's very dear to me. I was a teacher for over 30 years, and I've watched special education. Is it a must? Absolutely. It's a must-have, but it's also a must-watch, because one of the things that concerns me is the stigma involved. And we live, unfortunately, in an age of bullying, where children are not only bullied by others, but their self-esteem.
Well, let me loop back a little bit there,
Okay.
Vin, and talk a little bit about that stigma that you just mentioned.
Okay.
And that's part of the topic. Is it something that we must have we're talking about isolated special education here, not
Right.
So I know some schools are trying mainstream
Yep.
mainstreaming special education or special needs children within the other kids, and I'll just call them the regular kids for lack of a better word. I'm not sure what other word to use, but there is a stigma attached, like you mentioned, and it's always been there. I know when I was a kid, there was always, sort of whispers about the special ed child. So why do you think there is a stigma attached to needing those special education services?
For many years, you're right, special ed children were isolated. When I was in elementary school, we had a classroom with a label on the door that said opportunity class. Well, if you were in opportunity class, it meant that you weren't good enough for the normal class. Plus, there was modified English and regular English. If you were in modified English, you were almost in opportunity class, but not quite. And these labels are labels that children use also to label themselves. And they figure, this is as good as I'm going to get because this is what I am. My question is not what do we do to label the children, to identify the children, and then what do we do to remediate whatever it is that made them this special ed, which I would like to believe is a special kind of normal. And one thing I learned in teaching is that children have windows, and some of them learn a little faster than others. And I've watched groups. One of the things that has always bothered me in education is that if you're 11, you belong in this grade. If you're 12, you belong in this grade. Well, you know what? 11-year-olds aren't the same. And when I look out into that classroom, I don't see children who are the 6th grade. I see 28 different people.
Well, you're taking it in a different direction altogether, which I'm going to ask you about, David, because Vin seems to be saying that we should go beyond the whole special ed spectrum, if you will, and stop labeling children as special ed within the 6th grade or the 5th grade or the 4th grade, and have kids sort of labeled by their abilities. So if you happen to be a 10th grader with these type A abilities over here, and you also happen to, if you're 10 years old, or if you're 12 years old, if you're 13 and you have these abilities, then you should be here. Now, of course, there are cost measures and what have you in schools. So what do you think about this whole idea of special education versus the mainstream versus, the gifted kids? What do you think of the whole labels and the stigmas that are attached to one thing versus another?
I believe that labels, while necessary for the terms of diagnosis and pinpointing problems that need to be worked on, the stigmas, like it has been said, do create a kind of mindset within the child. If you're going to have a kid, and kids are kind of have a idea of the homogeneous kind of lifestyle, in that you have to do what everybody else does. I mean, you have teenagers who follow trends and want to be like their peers. When you have kids who are given these labels and are told that they have special needs or do not do things like the other kids, that's going to create the mindset where they say, what's wrong with me? Is there something that I did wrong? Is there something wrong inside? And that creates a self-esteem issue, which manifests itself, even if they are getting the proper treatment for the physical and mental problems, that creates the mindset that can still haunt them later in life. So the specific label and just kind of separating them from the rest of the mainstream can cause problems in and of themselves.
Vin, I want to ask you, based on your experience, because I know I've seen children growing up, and unfortunately, the story that I have, the anecdote that I have, based on the stigma of special education, doesn't end well. I knew a mother who was more terrified of the stigma than the child even was. I don't think the child understood I'm going into special education is necessarily a bad thing. I think for the child, if he would have gotten those services, it would have been great. But for the mother, who was so mortified that her child could potentially end up in special education, that she refused to have him get those services. She refused to have the school evaluate him, even though she knew the child was struggling. And it ended up being a story where this child struggled in elementary school. He struggled in junior high. He struggled in high school until finally getting to 10th grade and saying, I can't do this anymore, and just dropped out. So it wasn't a good story, and it's really based on the mother. Now, what do you have? I'm sure you've seen that in your 30 years.
Absolutely.
Where you have the kids who are struggling and you have the parents. So what would you tell a parent who's struggling with that, trying to overcome that stigma and holding the child back in a way because of it?
If you have a car that's a wonderful vehicle, but there's a part of it not working, what you need to do is fix that part. And it's the same thing with children. Not all children can perform well. Some of them do have real deficiencies. There's problems that they have to overcome. Well, as a school system, we have to find those problems and remediate them. And we have to be very careful of how we do it. If we completely isolate the child to fix that problem, we might create some other problems in the other areas. Because, remember, we don't teach curriculum. We teach children. So we have to see the whole child. And we have to be sure of what's causing that deficiency. Is it that the child has an inability to learn? Or is it because that child has so many other things going on? Children live in several domains. School is one domain, but the home, the community, the socioeconomic or the social political world, there's many domains. So if these four are failing, this one is going to suffer. So we have to be sure that what we're seeing is right. So we have to make sure that our tools are right. We have to make sure that our curriculum is right. Look at what's happening right now with core curriculum. It was a wonderful idea for some and killing others.
But what do you do then? I mean, what do you do when you have a school, say, and obviously there are always there are cost-saving measures that are in place for schools, and they really do want that whole one-size-fits-all approach for the kids because it's easier, it's less costly that way.
Exactly.
So what do you do then when you have 99 children who can't handle the core curriculum, and then you have that one child who cannot, for whatever reason? It could, it could be for one of the four other reasons. There's a divorce going on, or they're not sleeping well because they have four other siblings sharing a room, or which would be a socioeconomic issue. So what do you do then at that point with that one child who's struggling, and now you're kind of holding the other ones back, trying to deal with it?
You're exactly right, and it is a dilemma. Fortunately, I've been associated with 3 schools in particular. All of those 3 school systems really do a great job. The Mahopac schools do what they can for special education. However, it is a tough job, just as you say, because there are so many factors that weigh in. We look at this whole thing about ADD and ADHD, And we see that children have a difficulty focusing. Holy cow. Look at what we're creating. We have children watching TV, listening to the radio, and playing video games at the same time while they're doing their homework. You know, we're creating these multitask, and some kids can handle it, some kids can't. And I even question the ADD and ADHD, and I wonder if sometimes it isn't that they can't focus, is it they focus in only one area at a time. So while the teacher is going on and on and on, nothing is going in. They're focusing. It's not that they're not focusing, they're focusing in a different place. So how do we get the children to learn how to focus? Well, it is important that they are taught how to focus, that they're taught certain skills. There are some children who go from one grade to the next and leave some skills behind. Someone has to teach them. But, it's as you say, what do you do if only one kid has that problem and you have 28 kids in the class? Do you send that one out? Do you send a teacher in? For a long time, that's what they did. They sent a special ed teacher into the classroom to work with the regular classroom. There are so many different things. Now, do they all work? Some do, some don't. The problem is, I think, and it's not tracking a child, but it's becoming very aware that children are people too. They're individuals. And we have to look at all those individual needs. It's hard to do. I taught for 30-something years, and in those 30 years, it was frustrating sometimes because you can see it and you're not quite sure what to do with it. Well, we had wonderful special ed teachers. Well, and I can say it, when I was in Pelham, the Pelham schools had an amazing special ed department. But we all knew who the special ed kids were. And it
you
came
still
with a
can't,
risk.
yeah, you still can't
Yes.
remove that stigma. Now, David, I want to talk a little bit about ADD and ADHD, because this has just really exploded in the past 10 years, and no one really knows why. It could be, as Vince said, because there are so many things vying for children's attention, so what they're calling ADHD or ADD may not be a physical problem at all. It may be sort of a concentration problem or a learning style problem. We don't know. But an unprecedented number of children are being diagnosed as ADHD or ADD. What do you think now is the solution, or your thoughts on a possible solution where you have a huge number of kids who could potentially be going into special education now, and the schools simply do not have the resources?
Well, I actually had spoken to a woman about 2 years ago. She's a physical therapist, but she works in the special education field. She was telling me that two major problems that she's been facing, and that other therapists have been facing, has been lack of funding from state and government, and just the top-down approach to how they diagnose and treat children. When you talk about ADD and ADHD, as was mentioned, it could really just be a phase for some of these kids, and especially with the way our society works now and how kids process things. Again, we do have TV, computers, music, video games, all these different things competing for a child's attention. And studies have been finding that this newer generation is actually coping with it very well. They are becoming multitaskers. In some cases, I do wonder if it's not so much that there was a problem, but that's just the evolution of how we handle things now.
That's interesting.
Our attention span is so rapidly changing and adjusting to everything that maybe that's just how we cope with things now.
So now the school system has to change to kind of cope with these new breed of children, basically.
And the problem is, I think we still have the same criteria that we had 10, 20 years ago, where if a kid can't follow a lecture for more than 2 minutes, they're automatically considered to have a problem. The woman I spoke to said that with physical therapy, the criteria when they diagnose a child, like someone who couldn't hop on one foot for more than 2 minutes had a disability. And it's,
wow.
when you have tests that are either so outlandish that that a normal child would not be able to conform to them, or you just have the idea of that something is automatically wrong, especially nowadays where we as a society have to consider treatment has to begin very early.
Yes.
The younger the better.
That is true.
Because you're going to see the progress and possibly help them overcome and maybe even completely eliminate these symptoms. But the younger you start, the more you have to think of, I have to look for something. I, as a therapist, have to look at, is there a symptom there, and I have to catch it as quickly as possible. So it becomes the mentality. I believe there was the medical slang of when you hear the hoofbeats, you look for the horse, not the zebra.
Yeah.
It's basically, in essence, it's like it's looking for the most common problem. But we're so laser focused now on the idea that there is a problem to begin with and that we have to catch it as quickly as possible that it kind of creates a loop.
Yeah. Well, I think that was part of an issue that I had with my son. And a lot of us too, as parents, we expect our kids to be perfect. We want to have these perfect little human beings, and they have to be smart and sweet and kind and everything else. And then you get someone and you're like, where did you come from? And that was sort of my issue with my son, who has a very strong personality. And he started school, and the teacher, who was a very new teacher, she was very green, didn't have children of her own, and she kept saying, there's something wrong with your son. There's something wrong with your son. You need to get him evaluated. And I would look at him, and he just seemed to be, sort of all over the place. Yeah, he's, he was a little boy. And I remember going to an older teacher in the school, and I said, "Do you think there's something wrong with my son?" And she's like, "No, he's a 5-year-old boy." And I did end up getting him evaluated and looked at and everything else. And what I found from dealing with my son and going through that issue with my son was that he just had a different learning style. That teacher, like I said, she was a very new teacher. She had these new agey approaches to teaching, and she allowed the kids to make their own choices. So being a 5-year-old boy, given a choice between sitting down and reading quietly and running around the room like a nut, he was going to run around the room like a nut, and she'd be like, well, you're making the bad choices. You're not making the right choices. So I really had to learn to look at what his learning style was, give him some structure and some guidelines, and he was fine. From after he left that teacher's classroom, I never had an issue with another teacher again saying there was something wrong with him. And I think maybe a lot of times we, as parents, defer to the school system. We're either so busy fighting the so-called stigma, or we're too busy deferring that we're not looking to see what is it that my child needs and what can I do.
Can I make the point also? I believe there was a kind of changing of the mindset in terms of how parents dealt with the school systems. I remember seeing a political cartoon where back in the 1980s and 90s, if a kid had a kid has a report card and has an F on it, a big giant red F on it, the parents were screaming at him. Fast forward to 2010, the kid has a report card with a giant F on it, the parents are screaming at the teacher. So even in the mindset of just the education, the parents believe that, like you said, the child is a special little snowflake. There's nothing wrong with them. So just with education alone, that's a touchy subject. So when you go into, my child might have a problem, it kind of goes on them in terms of, it can't be my problem. I'm a good parent. I know what I'm doing. Maybe it's the rest of whatever, so there's no problem. End of discussion.
That's true.
You're both bringing up some excellent points, that many times parents have the stigma. And that what happens is when they hear, your child's not perfect, they're like, you're talking about the wrong kid, not my kid. And unfortunately, that sometimes goes over to the child. And we do have to remember that schools mean well. There are some wonderful teachers out there, and there are some wonderful programs out there. Now, does that mean every child is diagnosed correctly? Every child is placed correctly?
That's true.
That and for every moment of that child's life? No. It's a hard task. And we have to give our schools a lot of credit for trying. The old school days where the factory model, America worked under the factory model for years. The kids you're on a conveyor belt. If today is Monday, January 16th, we're on page 71, period. Well, core curriculum is kind of doing that again, where the curriculum was the most important thing. And standards.
So you think we're actually taking a step back with the core curriculum?
I think the core curriculum needs to be looked at again. I mean, is it perfect the way it sits? No way. Now, I've retired 5 years ago, so I am out of that a little bit, but I have been trying to keep up. And what I'm discovering is that we still need to understand. We don't teach curriculum, we teach children.
So
we need to prepare them for the world they're going to go into. So many things about our educational system train them to be learners, but does it train them to be citizens of the world they're going to have to live in the rest of their lives?
So I guess what we're saying, because we have to wrap it up and get into our lightning round discussion,
Wow,
is
already?
that was fast, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Is that we're seeing special ed, I guess, as a necessary evil.
Yes.
It's not ideal, but it's something that right now, based on what we have, and the obvious alternative is just not to provide any services at all, is a necessary evil.
Yeah, and I don't even see it as a necessary evil. I see it as a necessary. I mean, it just has to be done, because not everyone may have been created equally, but they're not equal all their lives. And you have to do something to give them the opportunity to be their special kind of normal.
Yes, perfect.
I'd also like to make one quick point.
Go ahead.
I think it's also important to understand the idea of, when we say the idea of normal and the problem of isolation versus just dealing with people who might not understand, I think we need to have more education with kids who are not considered disabled, to familiarize them with people who are disabled, so that there is more of an integration and there's less of a stigma.
Well, I think that's the argument too for the mainstreaming of children with special needs, is that if you have them in the classroom with the kids who are considered quote unquote normal, is that that's a reflection of real life, because they're not going to be in a little room when they go to work, or they're
Prepare them for the world they're going to live in.
It's mutually beneficial.
Exactly. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for that discussion on special education. We're going to move on to our lightning round. And our lightning round, which is completely unrelated, has to do with performance-enhancing drugs.
Uh-oh.
And what is the hoopla about performance-enhancing drugs? Because you know we have A-Rod, who's fighting everybody about being suspended for, I think, the most of the next baseball season over his use of performance-enhancing drugs. And David, I should ask you, is the proper term performance-enhancing drugs, or is it performance-enhancing devices? Because as we know, as we learned from the Lance Armstrong issue, he wasn't using drugs. He was basically oxygenating his blood and blood transfusions and all kinds of stuff that we can't really get into. But I guess it would be PEDs, performance-enhancing devices, instead of drugs now. So what's the hoopla? What do you think? Why are we so fascinated by this? Why are we clutching our pearls and wringing our hands because these athletes who have to do these feats of greatness and have to do it day after day and year after year, season after season, why is it such a big deal for us?
I think it goes to our definition of what we consider sportsmanship and athleticism. When you go back to ancient Greek times, and the idea of the athlete was someone who can perform these physical feats through hard work and training, and it was the pinnacle of human achievement and physicality. When you put drugs into the mix and you create this artificial performance where you have guys knocking the ball out of the park every single time, or you are breaking records, is that truly an achievement? Is that truly the sweat of your brow and the work of the individual? Or is that just a supplement and an illusion based on what the people want to see, but not what really means what it means to train?
But we're asking these people to entertain us. We're saying, A-Rod, go out there and you be the best baseball player that you can ever be. I want to see the feats of greatness. And Lance Armstrong himself, I think he was asked point blank, is this possible to do, cycling through these countries for miles and miles and miles? I mean, my knees creak after a cycling class, one class. And we're asking this man, you're going to cycle through an entire country. You're going to go through countries. You're going to do miles and miles. Is it really unfair to ask him for him to try to take care of himself a little bit better by oxygenating his blood or whatever it was that he was doing so that he could hold up under the pressure?
Here's the problem.
Yeah.
If it's unfair to not let him do that, then it's unfair certainly to let the guy he's competing against not do that. The whole idea is that many of these athletes are competing against others. For them to take enhancing drugs and then go up and accept a trophy for an unfair advantage over their competitors is not right.
Well, according to Lance Armstrong, everybody was doing it. So
everybody and everybody
have
at the
to-
same rate, baloney. Didn't happen. And
Okay.
that's the thing. We can't, if we can regulate it and say everyone gets the same amount of drugs.
Yeah, okay.
That's one thing.
I get what you're
But you're
saying.
talking competition. If Lance Armstrong is riding across the country on his own, that's one thing. But if he's competing for money and fame, then I think the playing field has to be even.
Well, that was a great discussion, you guys. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone out there who's watching The Opinion. Please keep sending us your feedback, your thoughts, your comments. We love getting them. Check us out on YouTube and leave us your comments there. And, thank you for watching The Opinion Talk Show.